All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. There might be a few more people joining momentarily. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Norins. I direct the First Amendment Clinic at the University of Georgia School of Law. And I want to thank Mallory Miner for inviting us to give this afternoon's presentation, and also to thank Kathy Brister from the Georgia First Amendment Foundation for coordinating the logistics for today's program. So we know that a lot of you are involved with responding to open records requests and facilitating open meetings. And so open records and open meetings are really the cornerstone of open government and transparent government. And so our hope today with this presentation is to make the Open Meetings Act and the Open Records Act of Georgia more accessible to you, more understandable, and also to give some tips on reducing the burden of complying with those laws. So our main presenters today will be Christina Lee and Arub Kawaja, who are both legal fellows in the First Amendment Clinic. Christina graduated from Cornell Law School in 2021. She was a student in the Cornell First Amendment Clinic at the time. And after graduation, she worked for 3 years at the law firm of Cahill, Gordon, and Reindel in New York City. And she joined the First Amendment Clinic in August of this year. And Arub is a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law. And while in law school, she interned with the Knight First Amendment Institute, which is at Columbia University. And she was also an intern with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Before law school, Arub worked as a policy specialist on legal investigations at Google. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina and Arub. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them into the chat. And we will also have time at the end for people to ask questions. So thank you, Christina and Arub. I will hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Claire, for that introduction. And thanks again to the City of Stonecrest for inviting us to speak today. I'm Christina Lee, as Claire previewed, and I'm going to be speaking with you first. And this morning, we'll be speaking about the requirements under the Georgia Open Records Act and the Georgia Open Meetings Act. I'm sorry, now it's this afternoon. So just before we get started, I want to note that this presentation contains general legal information and is not intended to be legal advice about any specific factual scenario. And if in the future you encounter a specific scenario or situation and you have questions about how best to handle it, you should feel free to reach out to the First Amendment Clinic and we can help you through that scenario. I also want to quickly highlight the various open government guides available on the Georgia First Amendment Foundation website. So the Red Book includes the Georgia Open Records Act and the Georgia Open Meetings Act. The Blue Book touches specifically on law enforcement records. We'll discuss some highlights regarding law enforcement records in this presentation, but the Blue Book goes into further detail if you think that information would be helpful to you. And finally, the Yellow Book includes information about court proceedings and court records. We won't be diving into that area today, but just know that that resource exists should you need it. You can download electronic copies of all these booklets for free on gfaf.org. I think Kathy just put those in the chat if you're interested. We'll also talk later about a practical guide for local governments created by the First Amendment Clinic and GFAF on simplifying open records and meetings. So let's start by diving into the Open Records Act, which is really the state's primary mechanism for giving citizens access to public records. Georgia's first constitution, which was adopted in 1777, mentions the idea of public records. That constitution required that public records be transferred to and kept by the county where those records were from. In the centuries since, the Georgia legislature has enacted various iterations of public records laws. Now, the current version of the Open Records Act opens with this statement of intent. It states that the General Assembly finds and declares that the strong public policy of this state is in favor of open government, that open government is essential to a free, open, and democratic society, and that public access to public records should be encouraged to foster confidence in government. The Act goes on to state that, for those reasons, the Act's provisions should be broadly construed to allow the inspection of governmental records, and exemptions from disclosure should be interpreted narrowly. So the state's history surrounding public records and the text of the Open Records Act itself shows that in Georgia, we want people to know what their government is doing. Let's first talk about what types of entities are subject to the ORA. The Act states that agencies shall produce for inspection all records responsive to a request. So what counts as an agency? That term is defined very broadly. Any state or local agency is subject to the ORA. That includes units created by those agencies. So the ORA would apply to departments, commissions, councils, boards, authorities such as hospital authorities, school districts, and other political subdivisions. The ORA also covers nonprofit entities if they receive 1/3 of their funding from government sources. Finally, the ORA applies to private entities that carry out government functions. For example, the Georgia Supreme Court has held that a private nonprofit corporation operating a hospital was carrying out a government function. In that case, the Fulton County Hospital Authority leased a hospital facility to a corporation, and the Fulton County Hospital Authority mandated that that corporation operate and expand the authority's health system. So because the private hospital was operating the authority's health system, it was subject to the ORA. Now let's turn to what types of records have to be disclosed under the ORA. The ORA's definition of what counts as a public record is also very broad. It includes all documents, papers, letters, maps, books, tapes, including both video and audio recordings, photos, computer-based or generated information, data, data fields, or similar material prepared and maintained by an agency or that is received by an agency. There are a lot of things included on that list. In practice, a public record could be anything from meeting minutes to executive session affidavits, to budget documents, to zoning records, to training materials, etc. The list can go on and on. The ORA also applies when these types of records are transferred to a private entity for storage or future governmental use. So you can't just say that that zoning record from 1940 isn't a public record subject to disclosure because we sent it to a private storage facility. It's still a public record, even if it's currently housed in a private storage facility. That's true of electronic information as well. So government data that's currently stored with a private vendor is still subject to disclosure under the ORA. I mentioned computer-based information in that list just now. That includes electronic data. So things like text messages and emails are subject to the ORA. And it's not just texts and emails that are sent or received from a government account. The Georgia Attorney General's office has said that the ORA extends to text messages and emails generated from a personal account if the messages relate to an agency's business. It also applies to government social media accounts. It doesn't matter that it's on Facebook, which is a private platform. If it's a government Facebook page, for example, then digital content related to that page is subject to the ORA. Importantly, though, the ORA does not require agencies to create records that don't exist at the time of the request. So if a requester is requesting records relating to a financial audit of a department, but the report with the audit findings hasn't been written yet, the agency does not have to create a report just for the requester. Instead, the agency can produce whatever records they have at that time. So how long do you have to respond to an open records request? You have to produce records within a reasonable amount of time, not to exceed 3 business days of receiving the request. The first day of that 3-day clock really starts on the first full business day after receiving that request. So if I submit a request on Monday, December 9, you have to respond to me by sometime on Thursday, December 12. If the records just cannot be produced within those 3 days, you're still required to affirmatively respond within that 3-day window. In that response, you have to provide a description of the records and, more importantly, a timeline for when those records will be released. One important thing to note here is that the agency has 3 business days to respond, and the clock starts when the agency receives that request, not when the request makes it to a certain employee. So you want to make sure that you have good internal processes to ensure that the request is actually getting to the people who can respond in a timely manner. You can require that all written requests be submitted to a designated records custodian or clerk, but you still have to respond within that 3-day time frame. So any absences should not cause delay. The 3-day clock starts ticking whether the designated clerk is in the office that day or not. Ultimately, the ORA requires that records be released as soon as practicable. So you really can't delay producing records just because someone in the agency wants to. It doesn't matter if that agency head wants to wait until next Thursday because the records will be less likely to make the news that day. If records are ready before that, they need to be released. So we've talked about what entities are subject to the ORA, what types of records folks can request, and when you have to respond. Now let's turn to what folks cannot get under the ORA. So what records are exempt from disclosure? There are many, many exemptions under the Open Records Act. Some of those exemptions are mandatory and others are discretionary. We won't be talking about all of them today, but you can find a list of exemptions in the Red Book. It's not a complete list, but it does lay out many of the exemptions in further detail. Medical and veterinary records are exempt from disclosure. The reasoning there is that disclosing them would be an invasion of personal privacy. Records of pending law enforcement investigations and prosecutions are also exempt. We'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. Motor vehicle accident reports are exempt from disclosure. However, people involved in the accident and their attorneys can get those reports. Trade secrets are also exempt. So if a construction company submits its super secret cement mixing formula as part of a bid for a construction project or as part of required paperwork throughout the project, that formula would be exempt from disclosure. The ORA also exempts from disclosure communications protected by the attorney-client privilege, as well as information collected by neighborhood crime watches or during burglar alarm installations, like names, home addresses, phone numbers, security codes, etc. Probate court records about weapons carry licenses are also exempt. Personal income tax records are exempt, but property tax records are not. Finally, the personal information collected by agencies is not public ORA under the ORA, and this includes social security numbers, birth dates, mother's birth name, financial information, account numbers, medical and insurance information, and unlisted telephone numbers. So that information should be redacted prior to producing a record. However, there's an exception to that exemption for news gathering. Essentially, if a requester swears in writing that he's using the information in reporting or news gathering, you would not redact social security numbers or birthdays or months. This news gathering exception exists because we want to ensure accurate news. Journalists need to be able to verify identities to ensure they're talking about the right person. There is also a similar exception for personal information of people who are identified in public records as public employees. However, the news gathering exception does not apply to records about public employees. And it's important to note that non-personal information contained in job applications, performance evaluations, or other personnel files is not exempt from disclosure. So someone can request the salary of a public employee or their disciplinary record, for example. You want to remember that the ORA should be construed broadly in favor of disclosure, and all of these exemptions should be interpreted narrowly. The ORA also protects people who disclose things in good faith. This kicks in if an employee makes an honest mistake. For example, maybe an employee didn't redact my social security number because they just missed it while they were preparing documents. They cannot be sued for making that mistake. So you should not be over-redacting information out of fear that you'll get sued or get in trouble if you accidentally disclose it. I want to shift our focus briefly to touch on law enforcement records. You can find more information about law enforcement records in the Blue Book, which I mentioned earlier. There are a lot of law enforcement records that are considered public records subject to disclosure under the ORA. This includes records in closed investigations, which would also include things like crime lab reports and photographs. We'll talk about records in pending investigations more in a minute. The public can also get initial incident and arrest reports, departmental policies and procedures, criminal history records for in Georgia felony convictions, and internal affairs records. Those become public record 10 days after the investigation is submitted to the agency for action, or 10 days after the investigation is concluded. 911 materials and computer-aided dispatch reports in closed cases are also subject to disclosure, as are certificates of training, applications for employment, and dash cam or body cam recording in closed cases. That's not actually true everywhere, but in Georgia, dash cam and body cam recordings are public records. All of these things do have to be disclosed under the ORA. There is an exemption for law enforcement records in pending investigations and prosecutions. So records in pending investigations or pending prosecutions are not required to be released. But those records will be subject to disclosure when the investigation is concluded or the file is closed. Concluded or closed does not necessarily mean that the case has been solved. Records in cases that are unsolved but are otherwise closed are still subject to disclosure under the ORA. In contrast, initial incident reports and arrest reports are required to be released and should be released upon request, regardless of whether they're part of an active investigation. This includes the initial incident report, any supplemental report attached to the incident report, any narrative attached to the report, and any similar documents attached to the incident report. You can redact some personal information from initial incident reports, such as addresses, phone numbers, or the identities of dependents or immediate family members. However, you cannot keep separate internal and public versions of initial incident reports. What I mean by that is you cannot keep a full version of the incident report for only the agency and a different version with less information that you produce to journalists or the public. A sheriff's office in North Georgia tried to do that. The Attorney General's office was clear that there's nothing in the ORA that allows agencies to maintain two different versions of a public record and to withhold an internal copy when there's no statutory exemption that applies. Let's now talk about what you need to do if you're denying a request or redacting part of a document. If access to a record is denied in whole or in part, you have to tell the requester in writing what specific legal authority you have for denying access or redacting that document. Basically, you need to tell them which specific exemption applies. When citing the specific exemption, you need to cite that specific statute code section, subsection, and paragraph. You should do this within 3 business days in your response to the requester. Or if search and retrieval of the records is delayed because the records aren't available within the 3-day window, within 3 business days of when the records have been retrieved. Then any redactions must be made by the lowest cost qualified employee. Now we'll turn to what fees an agency can and cannot charge. The ORA says you may charge reasonable fees for copies of records, not to exceed 10 cents per page for letter or legal size documents. You can also charge the actual cost of media for producing electronic records. So if electronic data needs to be burned to a CD to be produced, the agency can charge for the actual cost of that CD. You can typically charge for time spent searching for, retrieving, and redacting documents, but the first 15 minutes of that time are free for the requester. After the first 15 minutes, you can charge a rate that does not exceed the hourly rate of the lowest paid full-time employee who has the necessary skills and training to do those tasks. And it's important to note that you cannot charge a fee to inspect records routinely subject to inspection, such as deeds, city ordinances, and zoning maps. You should give an estimated cost to requesters before preparing records. If it will cost more than $25 to produce the records, you have to notify the requester of that estimate, and you are allowed to wait to search for those records until the requester agrees that he will pay the estimated cost. Note that that's different than requiring prepayment or payment in advance, which can only be done in very limited situations. An agency can require payment before searching and producing records only where the requester has outstanding fees for prior records requests or the cost of producing records will exceed $500. So to review, if the cost to produce the records is going to exceed $25, you can wait to do the search until the requester basically promises to pay the cost in the future. But you can only require prepayment if the cost is going to be more than $500 or if the requester has not paid previous fees for prior records requests they made. Finally, you cannot charge requesters for the time that your attorney spent advising you on whether records should be disclosed. So how many requests are too many requests? The ORA does not impose a limit on the number of requests an individual can make. The law does not allow the number of requests to be used as grounds to deny records. We often hear municipal agencies say that they get a large volume of requests and it can be difficult to keep up with them. To try to help with that, we have a few different suggestions. We always suggest that agencies consider making more proactive disclosures, and we'll talk about this more in detail later. It's worth looking at what types of documents people request over and over and thinking about whether you can go ahead and publicly post those somewhere. For example, if there are boards or commissions that host regular meetings where the minutes aren't proactively posted online, that's certainly something to consider doing. If folks can find it themselves online, they're less likely to file a request, and that can save you some time. You can also encourage people to submit requests in writing. People don't have to submit a request in writing to be an open records request. An oral request is still a valid request. For example, someone could call the clerk's office and ask for last week's meeting minutes, and that would be a valid request. But you can ask people to make their requests in writing, both to help you keep track of when it came in and to have something to refer back to when you're searching for responsive records. That being said, sometimes people submit written requests that aren't very clear. So we'd encourage you to ask requesters for clarification when you're not sure what they're asking for. We often tell requesters to be specific in their requests. We tell them to include the title or number of the document if it has that kind of identifier. We've also told people that it can be helpful to send a blank version of the document they're seeking with their request. So don't be afraid to do the opposite. If you don't know what they're asking for, you can ask if the document has some kind of identifier or if they have a blank version of what they're looking for. Or if they're looking for records that don't have a specific identifier, you could try to have a conversation with the requester to understand what they are looking for. Sometimes if localities aren't really sure what the requester is asking for, they'll just generically respond that there aren't any responsive records. Then the requester gets frustrated and it becomes this kind of unnecessarily adversarial process. Sometimes you can avoid that situation by having a conversation with the requester before you start searching for the responsive records. Seeking clarification can help you save time when searching for those documents. And finally, we'd recommend working with requesters to narrow their request if what they're asking for is so broad that it'll take you forever to process. If you talk to them about what they're looking for, you may be able to work with them to come up with some narrower search terms or date ranges, for example. Often folks will be open to that conversation because they understand they'll get their records sooner and they appreciate the effort from the agency. So what are penalties for failing to follow the requirements of the Open Records Act? Well, there are criminal and civil penalties. Any person who knowingly and willfully violates the ORA or who is knowing and willfully frustrating or attempting to frustrate access to records can be found guilty of a misdemeanor and can be assessed at a $1,000 fine. Then any additional violations within 1 year can result in a $2,500 fine. In civil actions, the court can impose a $1,000 fine for the first violation and a $2,500 fine for additional violations within 1 year. Agencies can also be made to pay the attorney's fees of whoever brought the lawsuit. Before we move on, let's look at an example from the city of Atlanta. This is Jenna Garland, who was the press secretary to the mayor, and she was criminally convicted under the Open Records Act. A reporter attempted to obtain records of past due water bills from properties owned or occupied by the mayor, his family, and his friends. There were thousands of dollars of unpaid bills. Garland had this text exchange with the records custodian at the water department. You can see here she's telling the clerk to be as unhelpful as possible, to drag this out as long as possible, and to provide information in the most confusing format available. The Attorney General's office filed criminal charges. She was convicted and fined. She appealed, and that appeal was denied by the Court of Appeals. So this is obviously an example of what not to do. You cannot delay releasing public records just because releasing them is politically inconvenient for you, or because the records are going to make someone in your agency look bad. And don't let people like Jenna Garland try to persuade you otherwise or drag you into a situation like this. Now that we've discussed the contours of the Open Records Act, we'd like to refer you to one more resource. The clinic helpfully created a PDF called How to Simplify Open Records and Meetings, pictured here. You should have already received this handout when you got your login email for this webinar. The purpose of this resource is to help local governments help their constituents by making public access to records and meetings easier. The resource is split into public records and public meeting sections. We'll talk now about the public records portion. The public records section takes us through several tips that will streamline the public records process, making life simpler for you and your constituents. This is also a bit of a recap of the content we've just discussed. First, help record requesters help you. This means making it easier for citizens to find records on their own. One way to do this is by creating a public records webpage linked prominently from your homepage and using this page to provide links to a library of frequently requested public records. The resource has a list of some of the types of records you might want to proactively make available. You can also create an archive of responses to prior records requests, so you don't have to produce the same records more than once. Both of these strategies will reduce the number of public records requests that you have to respond to. Savannah, Georgia is a great example of a city that's doing some of this. You can see here that they have a portal for requests and also a link to an archive of prior requests. The second tip is to simplify the request process. On your public records page, provide contact information for the person to whom record requests should be submitted. You can designate one single person to receive all requests, or you can have different records contacts for each department. Providing an online request form for records can also streamline the process by reducing emails and phone calls to the designated records contact person. Third, let record requesters know what will happen after they make a request. This includes things that we've already talked about. You should let people know that you will either provide the records in 3 business days or provide a description of the records and a timeline of when you'll produce them, which must be as soon as practicable. Remember also that you don't have to create records that don't currently exist. Fourth, let records requesters know about cost. Remember, you don't have to charge at all to produce records, but if you do charge, post your fee schedule on the webpage so people have notice. Let the public know that you are only charging for the prorated time of the lowest paid full-time employee who is capable of searching for and producing the records. Also recall that you generally cannot require prepayment for producing records. And lastly, if withholding a record, explain why and cite the specific statute section and subsection that authorizes you to withhold the record. I'll turn it over now to my co-fellow Arut to talk about the Open Meetings Act.
Thank you, Christina. Now we'll discuss Georgia's Open Meetings Act. These laws are fairly broad with few exceptions, and that's because the goal of these laws is to promote transparency and public confidence in government bodies. This photo is of the 2019 Atlanta Task Force for Promotion of Public Trust, which was put together with the goal of increasing transparency and accountability in the Georgia government at the state level. Some examples of agencies and government bodies that are covered by the OMA include city council meetings, school district meetings, state legislative proceedings, and local board of commissioner meetings. This also includes meetings held by committees created by the governing body of an agency. For example, the OMA could apply to a meeting held by the budget committee created by city council or the board of an agency. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes a meeting that needs to be open to the public. Whenever a quorum meets for official business, the meeting must be open to the public. A quorum is the minimum number of members of a governing body that must be present to make the proceedings legally valid. 50% of the members plus one of a governing body constitutes a quorum. The quorum does not have to meet in person. Members could meet via telephone, Zoom, or even in a group text message, and the Open Meetings Act would still apply. To be considered a meeting, the members must be formulating, presenting, discussing, or voting on official business, policy, or a public matter of the agency. The few exceptions to this rule include when members meet either to inspect physical property, to attend relevant seminars or training courses, or to meet with legislative or executive branches of the state or federal government, to travel to other meetings, or for ceremonial, civic, or religious reasons. These exceptions only apply if no official business takes place during these gatherings. So what constitutes a meeting being open to the public? The public must have full access to meetings, which means being able to hear and see what is happening during the meeting. Access can be in person or remote, such as via Zoom access or live streaming. However, access must be in real time. It is not sufficient to only make a recording of the meeting available after the fact. The public is also permitted to record audio and visual during these meetings. Public comment at open meetings is not required under the OMA. The agency can decide whether to allow time during a meeting for public comment. However, this does not apply to school board meetings because there is a separate statute besides the OMA that requires public comment for school board meetings. Agencies must provide notice to the public before all meetings, even emergency ones. The public must be made aware of the date, place, and time of all meetings. For regularly scheduled meetings, notice should go out at least a week before, both physically posted at the regular meeting location and posted on the agency or committee's website. For non-regularly scheduled meetings, written or oral notice shall be given at least 24 hours in advance of the meeting. In the case of an emergency meeting held on less than 24 hours notice, the agency must provide notice within a reasonable time frame given the circumstances, which includes giving notice to the official newspaper with the largest circulation in that county. The public has a right to know what will generally be discussed in the meeting ahead of time, so they can make an informed decision as to whether they feel the need to attend. Before all meetings, the agency must make an agenda of matters expected to be considered. This agenda must be available upon request and be posted at the meeting site as far in advance as possible, but shall not be required to be available more than 2 weeks prior to the meeting. If there is something important that comes up during a meeting that wasn't on the agenda, then it can still be discussed and acted on. Members of the public have a right to know what happened during the meeting, even if they did not attend. So a summary of the matters acted on and which members were present must be made publicly available within 2 business days of the meeting. However, in addition to the summary, the regular minutes of the meeting should be promptly recorded and made available to the public no later than immediately following the next regular meeting. Minutes must include the names of members present at the meeting, descriptions of each motion or other proposal made, the identity of persons making and seconding motions or other proposals, and a record of all votes, including the name of each person voting for or against a proposal. At the very minimum, minutes have to include these bulleted items, but certainly more information is encouraged. The limited exceptions to the open meetings laws are generally known as executive sessions. An agency may close a meeting or portion of a meeting only if a significant statutory exception applies, and a meeting may be closed only by majority vote taken in a properly noticed and open meeting. If an agency does vote to close a meeting, then depending on agency rules, either the person presiding over the meeting or each member in attendance must file with the official minutes of the meeting a notarized affidavit stating under oath that the subject matter of the meeting was devoted to matters within the exceptions provided by law and identifying the specific relevant exception. Most commonly used exceptions are personnel matters, attorney-client discussion of litigation, and real estate matters. Now we will review the penalties an agency can face if they do not comply with the Open Meetings Act. All actions taken during a meeting closed in violation of the act are void and can be set aside by a court if challenged within 90 days. Officials who participate in closed meetings in violation of the act can be subject to recall. Failure to give adequate notice can result in the invalidation of the proceedings, plus the same penalties Christina already discussed for the Open Records Act. Now we'll turn back to the resource we discussed earlier titled How to Simplify Open Records in Meetings for some tips on how to make complying with the Open Meetings Act easier and more efficient for you and your constituents. First, create an Open Meetings webpage from the local government homepage. Use this Open Meetings webpage to post public meeting notices and agendas. And for regular meetings, post notices of the meeting time and location at least 1 week in advance of the meeting. And for meeting agendas, post at least 24 hours in advance of the meeting, including any documents attached to the agenda. After every meeting, post summaries of the meetings within 2 days of the meeting minutes no later than immediately following the next regularly scheduled meeting, including documents or presentations reviewed during the meeting, executive session affidavits, and any video and audio recordings of the meeting created by the government. The Atlanta Board of Education is a good example of this. If you click on the scroll icon here on the right, you can access the meeting minutes from all prior board meetings. And once you click on that, here's what it looks like. Make sure you know the law and are ready to explain it. Hopefully this presentation has helped you feel comfortable with that. For instance, remember the definition of meeting from the Open Meetings Act so that you know which meetings must be open to the public. And you can reference the definition here on this slide. Remember that an open meeting may occur in person or by phone, group text, or video conference. Remember that any member of the public may take video or make audio recordings at any meeting. Lastly, remember the rules for executive sessions, as we discussed earlier, and this can be posted on your city website as well. Explain that meetings can be closed for any of the statutorily defined reasons, such as attorney-client privilege, real estate deals, and discussion of disciplinary action, and that there must be a notarized affidavit from the person presiding over the meeting that states the specific statutory reason for the executive session. The affidavit must be included within the meeting minutes. Also, remember and post on your city website that any vote taken on matters discussed in an executive session must be taken in public and failure to make the vote public makes it non-binding. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you all for attending. Does anyone have any questions?
If you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and shout them out. Are penalties levied against governments or individuals? So that is a good question. I believe it can be either.
Also, thank you, Kathy, for sharing the resources in the chat. That's really helpful.
And although I don't have any questions, I really enjoyed the examples that you all provided throughout the presentation. The City of Savannah and also the Atlanta School Board. Yeah, Board of Education. Those were really good examples. So thank you all for including that information.
All right, well, thank you all for attending. And if you do have questions after this, please feel free to reach out either to GFAF or the First Amendment Clinic, and we will try to help you find the answer.